we go, jumping
Here
right
we
back
go.
into
Yeah,
this.
we have to drop the snowplow blade and just start plowing.
No chitty chat for us.
No.
This is important stuff.
Yeah. All right.
It's been great so far.
Yeah. Well, it's been fun. At least I'm having fun. I hope you're having fun.
I am.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
I've been telling a lot of people about it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, we are in chapter 4, so we're gonna try to close this out today. And basically, there's 3 major areas of discussion and then there's a nice conclusion. So I don't want to leave that out. But basically, it first is dealing with the question of truth and knowledge, in the age of AI, and then there's the question of work, and then there's and that's chapter 4, and then chapter 5 is the reality of war, AI and warfare. So, light topics, not a whole lot to cover on those areas.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's pretty dense. There's a lot of really amazing comments and insights and truths. And again, we can only hit highlights here. Just encourage the listeners to really take the time. A nice summer project. Sit down and make a daily study and just read paragraph by paragraph, because there's just so much rich, stuff here to chew on and
it is
contemplate.
inevitable. AI is inevitable.
Well, right, and I think it's not a question. At one point in the document, he talks about how, the 2 pathways that are presented to us is either to be afraid of it, or to just embrace it enthusiastically, unquestioningly.
Right.
And what he's really pointing out is that, no, technology is a part of the human experience. So there's always going to be technological advances. But the question is how do we make the dignity and the good of the human person the very center of both the development of technology, but also its use. And I feel like the church has become sort of the prophet to the world. Every time there's this major change or revolution, the church is always weighing in on it. And while we might not perceive the influence and the effect that the church has had, I think in reality, we do shape the conversation in probably more influential than just about any other organization out there.
Yeah.
Because, if Catholics spend any amount of time listening to what the church says, we start talking about it and we start trying to respond to that in faith. And I think it has a really positive impact. But I think the stakes are so high with AI that, I feel a sense of urgency and intensity around pushing the average Catholic in the pew, because when it comes to like nuclear proliferation, how many of us actually have any direct influence or participation in that reality? Like practically none of us. But with the digital ecology and space that we've created, everybody is participating in it and everybody is affected by it. So we all have a role to play, and therefore we really all need to be formed and informed and educated by the church on these issues. So,
who doesn't have any sort of like role or effect of this?
Who?
The Amish.
Well, that's
I
true.
grew up in a town that has an influx of Amish, and they sort of shun, at least this sect does, any sort of electricity. They use tools, but they draw the line at anything that requires electricity.
Yeah, until they need to get somewhere, and then they hire a driver who has a car that drives them there.
That's exactly right.
And then all the tourists show up with their GPS on their phones to get to their to their
butter shop.
We actually had some good friends that were over the years that were Amish when we lived back in Latrobe.
Yeah.
Some farmers that we got stuff from. They're great people, but they don't have to deal with this.
They're just sitting at home right now, peacefully and blissfully doing whatever it is they do.
Yes.
Whittling.
Hoping that the world doesn't come to an end.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's jump in on chapter 4. let's jump in on chapter 4. And the title of this chapter is Safeguarding Humanity at a Time of Transformation.
Mm.
And the first section, which I think kind of sets up the entire chapter, is this kind of subheading that truth as a common good. Truth is a common good. And going back to that principle of the common good, one way to look at, I always use this metaphor to help people understand the difference between kind of like a public good versus a common good. So a common good is something that the more everybody shares in it, it doesn't in any way diminish that thing. Okay, so like for example, a cake is not a common good because you have your piece, I have my piece, and after we all eat our piece, the cake is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And we can apply that like a public utility, for example, like a road is not a common good because we can't drive in exactly the same spot. We call that an accident.
Mm.
So it's a public good that we all have access to, and public goods are part of the common good. But the common goods are things that by our participation in them, they don't actually diminish. In some ways, they might even increase. So when he says that truth is a common good, he's spot on in saying that, because the more we know together as a community what is true, truth doesn't get parsed up and divided up and then kind of get reduced and diminished. The reality is that there's a kind of increase in the participation in truth the more we all know it. And so his insight here is the fact that because of the amount of power and control that a very small group of people have over influencing people's ideas and the way they think, and also the way technology has reduced dialogue and real conversation and real exploration and search, like research for the truth, because we can rely on, either a social media kind of where someone is just feeding you what you're supposed to think, or you think of AI where, you have these databases that are kind of doing your thinking for you. What happens is that there's a kind of eclipsing of the truth, and there's a kind of, a kind of intellectual darkness that you could say comes over us, which is obviously not a good thing. So that's kind of like as an umbrella statement. That's like what this whole chapter is trying to deal with. And again, we're getting into that part where we're dealing with directives. So while he's analyzing and describing what's going on, he's indicating here's how we should respond to it at the same time.
Okay.
So does that make sense? I mean, like looking at the question
so
of
it
truth.
sounds like common good, just to clarify, common good is probably things that are more like conceptual versus like is there any kind of material thing that is a common good? In other words, like everything, it seems like when people participate in a material good, it's going to get used up, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking more like common good or more things like lofty conceptual kind of things.
Yeah, and I think one way to think about the relationship between the different goods we're talking about is the common good is that set of conditions that we have to create by which people then have access to legitimate private goods, like a house, or a car, whatever, and also public goods, public utilities, or, roads, or, like a water system. It's interesting because water can be both a private good in terms of the water I drink is my good for my body. But if I don't have access to that water, there needs to be a utility that brings that water to me, and that's a public good. But the common good would be, well, do we have a political and cultural environment such that access to clean water is actually available? Or is there so much corruption, for example, that there's places where, there are places in the world where people can't get access to clean water. So you see, that's how those three goods play together. So he's making the case that truth is a common good, and we need to socialize ourselves in such a way that we can come to the truth and come to an understanding and knowledge of what is true. And there's a lot of things that are preventing that from happening right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the second thing I want to, you just sort of mentioned this in passing. Does he say, or was this more of a you statement, that AI does our thinking for us?
He does make the point that when we just look for the results of an AI kind of search, we're not engaging in a real thinking. Like we have to still engage the faculties of reason. So we have to fact check and we have to analyze the results and we have to. He breaks open a lot of different things that we should get into that I think are interesting observations about kind of what's wrong with the way the system's working now and what needs to be done in order for it to work in a way that's more conducive to human flourishing. So he, under truth as a common good, he talks about the relationship between truth and democracy, and that truth doesn't originate from a single source, a single centralized source. So whether that's a corporation, like you think about the censorship that's gone on, for example, on different social media channels, or you can think about propaganda through a news outlet, or you can think about propaganda through a government outlet, or So whenever there's a kind of stranglehold on conversation and honest inquiry, because everything's being filtered or channeled through, like singular points of communication, you're undermining democracy in that case. And so there's a need for dialogue and sound argumentation and fact checking. Like people need to come together and there needs to be a conversation, because truth, first of all, it's good to actually define truth, because a lot of times we think that the truth is out there, it's this thing. But truth, the word truth actually refers to the proper correspondence between the human mind and reality. And we've learned over the ages of the human race that when we try to come to a proper conceptualization or grasp or understanding of what is, we always do better when we do that collectively together, like as a community. We're dialoguing and we're arguing and we're debating and we're trying to research and then test our hypotheses. And you think about the scientific method, or you think about the philosophical method. That's always a community and multi-generational effort. No one person is ever going to have a perfectly comprehensive and objective view of anything.
Yeah.
So the problem with the digital world is that it has a tendency to really put a chokehold and to control the back and forth that's required to arrive at a proper understanding of the truth and of reality. And so that's one of the problems. The other problem that he mentions here is just the idea that we have a kind of crisis of truth, because we human beings in recent times have more and more come to see ourselves as the sole author of what is real. So we've become kind of navel-gazing or too much enclosed on ourselves, and we get to decide what things are going to be. Truth has become very relativized.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that.
Right.
That collectively, I feel like what you were just talking about, how it takes kind of like a back and forth, a push and a pull between groups of people to eventually arrive at the truth. But I feel like we're really struggling to do that, So, and again, going back to this idea that all AI is doing, at least my understanding of it, is just taking what's already out there and synthesizing it somehow. So in other words, if let's just use gender kind of like stuff that's going on, like there's a lot of relativistic stuff behind that. You determine what your gender sort of preference is, and for some of us, it's like that seems so illogical. Like there seems like such a lack of reason in that based on reality. But for an increasing number of people, that seems like that's a very true. It's like a truth, just like you and I are sitting in this room right now, talking to each other.
Yeah.
So when AI is kind of like putting it all together, and someone's trying to like get it to engage in that, it's just going to spit back what we are saying is
Right.
true.
It's just going to give back to us what we've inputted, and
Right.
that's an important point that the Pope makes is that it's not objective. It's what comes out the other end of any kind of inquiry is always based upon the inputs, and those inputs are expressive of a value system
Right.
that the creators have.
Right.
So, and it's interesting too, because the other way you can look at, like, say, the transgender movement, it's kind of social virus and we see a clear correlation between a massive rise in gender dysphoria with the advent of social media and the algorithm. So it becomes a kind of the power. There's a term the philosopher Charles Taylor uses called the social imaginary, and the social imaginary is just it's that kind of view of reality that a culture kind of acquires over time. We just kind of come to see the world. It's kind of a worldview, and lots of things help shape a worldview. But we have these. It's much less organic now. It's much more programmed and forced because of the algorithms and the programs, and the social media channels and the way those work, that there's just an enormous amount of power that a very small number of influential people, whether they're the programmers or whether it's the social media influencers themselves, we're able to shape public opinion and people's perception of things in ways that are very artificial. Like, they're not based upon people's reflection on reality and
Right.
and a deep inquiry and look into things. It's just like I love the term social virus. It's like it all of a sudden it's like a contagion. It's like just sweeps through the population, and you're like, wait a second, stop. Like,
Right.
is anybody thinking about anything anymore?
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem so.
Yeah.
I mean, not nobody, but what I mean.
I do.
So the other thing he mentions here under truth is that there's such an emphasis on a kind of pragmatism and a practical reason, and this is part of the technocratic mindset that we talked about before, things that are efficient, a kind of utilitarianism, but we don't ask the deeper questions like, what's the nature of things? Like, what's the nature of a human person? What really constitutes the human good? How ought we to live together as a society? Like, we don't frame out those questions anymore and try to wrestle with them and answer them, because we're just so concerned with just practical, efficiency, pragmatism, practicality. And while these tools are useful for those things, like, for example, if I need to know how to fix, like last winter, I had to change out the belt on my, on my snowblower, and I was grateful that I could go onto YouTube and get a "this is how you do it" kind of video.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
But it's not going to give me the meaning of my life. And when people are looking to those kinds of tools and responses for that, then we get into a lot of trouble. So yeah. So anyhow, so in terms of directives, then he says, we really have to develop what he calls an ecology of communication. And one thing I wanted to preface when it comes to these directives, when you read them, a lot of times it can sound like platitudes, like moral platitudes, kind of pie in the sky, like, oh, that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
But
admittedly, sometimes I'm over here thinking that.
Yeah, it does feel that way. But I think the reality is that what he's saying is true. So we can respond to it. We can take these things up, take them to heart, and do something with them, and get a different result, or we can choose not to. But someone has to say it.
Yes.
And that's the role of the church. This vision of reality has to be proclaimed, and some people will respond to it, and others won't. But
Yeah.
We're not going to force people to embrace these ideas.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's the whole thought process I have sometimes of the things you're saying is like, wow, that sounds so utopian, like, oh, that's if there was no sin in the world, if everybody had the same good intentions, that this would be great. And but and I think the thing I have to fight is that sort of defeatist, like the defeatism, like it's still worth the struggle to try to max those principles out in my life, even though I know they're never going to be realized fully. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's still worth it. It's worth everybody. Rather than taking the sort of throwing up the hands and being like, well, what's the point? Why even bother? Because that's the temptation.
Sure.
Like, why bother doing that? Why,
Well, and I think when we look at the total problem and think that somehow, like, I have to fix the total problem, then it's like, what's
Right.
the point? That's
Right.
never going to work. But I think if we think, okay, well, my responsibility, what gives me the freedom of conscience, or, a certain interior freedom in my conscience, is just knowing that with whatever little sphere of influence I have, I'm doing my little part. And
Yeah.
I don't have to be a perfectionist in it, but I should do something.
Yes.
And so, for example, like in my house, I can be vigilant as a father around what we do at the table when we're sitting together. The phones are down,
Mm-hmm.
and we're really present to each other.
Yeah.
I can do that. I can sit down and talk to my kids about the negative and potentially dangerous effects of social media.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have done those kinds of things.
Right.
But a lot of people just kind of unthinkingly just embrace whatever is the latest, newest thing out there, and they do it unreflectively.
Yeah.
And that's what I think a document like this is helpful, because it forces us to say, I shouldn't do that. Like,
Yeah.
I'm contributing to something that could go in a really bad direction.
Yeah.
If I don't question it and I don't wrestle with it.
Yeah,
So the platitudes are opportunities to respond and say, well, what can I do about this?
Yeah.
And whatever it is I can do, I should try to do something.
Yeah.
And if we all do a little something, then we see things change.
For sure.
Yeah, and that this happened with Rerum Novarum. I always marvel the reality, the lived experience of industrial labor radically changed worldwide because of Rerum Novarum. Like, it totally altered the course of history.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it completely altered the course of history. And you can't imagine it, that it could be so effective. But it was like, like back in the day when Fulton Sheen was on television, it was the #1 TV show in America. And you think, how is that even possible? But the #1 probably thing read worldwide was Rerum Novarum at the time, because people were so concerned about the conditions of the working class people and how horrible it was.
Yeah.
And so people took it up and said, this is finally, like, this is a breath of fresh air. Like, this is, like, we can get behind this. And it wasn't just Catholics. It was, like, lots of people who were not Catholic. So I do think a document like this has the potential to change the conversation if enough people will sit down and start reading it.
That's awesome.
So part of the ecology of communication, he talks about, we need, on the level of public policy, we need norms of greater transparency. So, like, we need to know what's going on behind the scenes. There's just a lot of, like, stuff going on that is manipulative, and that stuff needs to be discussed openly in public forums. And there also needs to, he says, to be a greater respect for people's privacy. So what we're doing with people's profiles and data, there needs to be regulation around it, because there's just too much abuse going on there.
Yeah.
There needs to be serious journalism, he says, and open forums of debate rather than just reactivity, where everybody's just kind of reacting. Especially, I think about the news cycle, for example, and it's like it's terrible. It's like you don't get the news. What you get is propaganda from one station or another, and it's really hard just to get to the bottom of what's going on. It's not honest journalism. It's sensationalism. It's exhibitionism. It's entertainment.
Yeah.
It's profit seeking.
Well, there's a reality that people's attention spans are like seconds. So it does crack me up sometimes when they have these bits on Fox or CNN, and it's like talking about a big topic where someone has maybe 30 seconds to answer a question, and then they talk over each other. It's there's nothing very informative about it.
And it's very biased. It's not journalism. Journalism
Right.
is supposed to be just telling you, here's what's happening. But there's always been the opinion column.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine.
Right.
But it seems like the entire lineup of programming on these news outlets.
Yeah, especially the video ones.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
It's just.
I mean, you can still read things, articles that people write, but there's still spots to get, I think, good journalism that way. But the video-based format kind of news stuff, it's kind of useless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you get little bits and pieces of stuff, but you have to do a lot of work. You have to spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
So that's we have to have a better ecology of communications, in media, and it needs to be more transparent, more honest, and more open, to dialogue and conversation and in differing viewpoints.
Sure. Yeah.
He talks about an alliance between educational organizations, and even government for a better, like for our time in this digital age of ours. And he talks about different things, like, for example, there's a kind of culture of immediacy. And I actually really, as an educator, I really like this section because he says that like social media fosters a culture of immediacy and hyperstimulation that leads to fatigue, boredom, and apathy, which makes truth-seeking really, really hard. Because truth-seeking is hard work. You have to labor, and you have to take time. Yeah. And so, education is a kind of long road that requires ongoing hard formation. And it's just become, everything is so instant and so microwaved, and we've become lazy. I mean, we've just become intellectually lazy. And so we have to double down our efforts in our educational system, read books.
Yeah.
Like I went back when I taught a course at the seminary a couple years ago. I went back to Blue Book exams. Like you have to write your answers out with a pen.
Oh man.
Yeah, because they had to really prepare for that and they had to really think about it. And I know that they knew the material better.
Yeah.
So we talked about this the last episode, but like logic, learning how to reason, how to understand fallacies, or how to do a research. I remember in college, my history professor, put all of these resources in the library on hold on this shelf. Now just think about this.
Right.
There's one copy of like 25 different books, and he gave a question and said, you have to cite at least 7 of these sources, and you have to find the answer to this question. Well, the only way you could get the answer in those days is you had to go and you had to check out the book and you could only take it out for a day or two. And the whole class had to have, there was like a coordinated effort, like you'd go in, it's like, oh, that book's out, I have to come back. I mean, it was like a concerted effort, and then you had to read all these sources.
Yeah.
And then you had to figure out, it was like a mystery that we had to solve. It was one of the best things I ever had to learn how to do, because I really had to learn how to research. So like we just don't teach these kinds of habits of learning, anymore. So people just they can't hold their attention for very long. They can't think very deeply, very logically, and very clearly about things. So he says that we really need to double down on helping educate people on the habits, the intellectual habits of of learning
Yeah.
and knowledge and intelligence and inquiry and things like this, which I
What's
couldn't agree
Yeah,
more with.
I do too. I think that for me, it's like a basic question at this point. It has to be like, what's the point of education? What's the goal of education? And I feel like the one thing you're talking about, and I agree with it, I think education is really kind of like whole life uh, success and preparation. You know, like,
Right.
whereas I feel like it's becoming very, very myopic. It's about um, more so about specific outcomes. Than it is, or fragmented than it is kind of like holistic, and which is I don't think it's very beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, we used to think about education in terms of educating the whole person
Yeah.
and educating them for life and not just to get a job.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, so it's become very reductionistic, very narrow, and very pragmatic,
Yeah.
and it's boring. Honestly, I think we've also helped kids lose their interest in learning. We don't cultivate their curiosity. We don't let them get their hands on stuff and really explore the world that God has made. It's just, I mean, we do it in the younger grades pretty well, but I think as kids get older into high school, it just becomes get into college, and then you get into college, it's like get a job. It's just not, it's not an education for the whole person.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of other things that he mentions is that we have to think about how we use technology in learning. So, and then we also have to think about how we educate people for the use of technology. So that's two different things. Like, is it good to have a tablet, for every kid to have a tablet in class? And it's like, watching my kids go through high school with those things, I just don't. I don't think it's helped learning.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like, well, how do you educate, children for the proper use? So
right.
that the tool gets subordinated to their dignity as a
Right.
human person,
Yeah.
rather than they just become a slave to this thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's that issue, and then last point on education is just that it's really got to be a collaborative effort between policymakers, educators, and parents.
Mm.
And there's different levels of education that have to take place. There's a lot that can be done in the home, around the proper moral education in the use of technology. And again, like I said earlier, a lot of times parents just kind of go along with what's ever going on.
Sure.
Sometimes I'll go out there and I'll see families, and their kids have a device in their hand all the time. It's just like babysitting them.
Oh, I know. It's a
Yeah.
battle. It's a constant battle in our house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyhow, any other thoughts on education? Like that's a pretty overarching sweep of what he tries to tackle in that section.
Yeah.
But
it's good.
there's a lot more that he says, but it's really insightful.
Yeah.
So but I think that covers the major parts. So the second half of chapter 4, then he goes on into to discuss the dignity of work in this time of transition as the economy goes through a kind of, I don't know, I think they're calling this the fourth industrial revolution.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Don't ask me to name. I mean, obviously there's the internet,
Yeah.
and probably TV and radio, was one, and then probably the industrial revolution. That was probably the first one. But yeah,
Okay.
so the looking at the dignity of work, he rehearses things that have been said many times about how work is an essential part of the human experience. It's not. I always like to point out, it's not a consequence of the fall. Like, we were always intended to work. Work is an expression of the person, and John Paul II always put the emphasis on the human person is the subject of work. So the purpose of work is for the good and the dignity of the person. It's not the other way around. And we oftentimes invert the value, and we say, oh, well, humans exist, for the sake of production, for the sake of profitability, wealth generation. But the reality is, it's just the opposite of that. That the work world exists for the sake of building up the dignity of the human person.
How so?
Well, it's just that it's the doing of work that is dignifying to the person. We, as part of the image of God, we are created to be creative and to be productive, to help participate in the work of God, which is to create. And so there's forms that work can take that are very dehumanizing, because we're alienated from the fruits of our work, or we have very little input to it. So I've said this before, when you use the machine or you use modern forms of technology that automate activities that human beings are doing, like in an assembly line kind of fashion, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then the question becomes, well, what role do humans play in the work of work, in the world of work?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what the Holy Father is trying to point out is the fact that AI and robotics has the potential to really displace people, so that there's obviously the problem of unemployment is a huge concern, and it's going to be very rapid and sudden. So there isn't time to make a transition or an adjustment. But it also raises the question, what is it that humans are going to be subject to the machine, or is it that the machines are going to be subject to the human? So what kind of work environments, what kind of working conditions are we going to create, and are we going to be attentive to the fact that a human person has dignity and their work is meaningful for that dignity? And if we don't create the right conditions, then what he says results is a kind of slavery. So, we become, you could say, slaves to the economic system that doesn't really serve the good of the human person. So that's like a major point that he's making to that.
Yeah, it seems like this. If you go back to the Garden of Eden, and God gave Adam some very specific sort of tasks to do, the early work, right? It seems like it's exactly what you said. Work right now is totally tied to an economic system, So in the end, it's almost like it can always get reduced to just about production, and monetary gain, right? We work to support our lives, like to pay for our bills, to pay for groceries, to pay for our cars. You know what I mean? Like work, for most people, work is not this sort of act of creative flourishing, because you have to make money. You know what I mean? And I don't know, like, if, not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying that's the reality. Like the kind of work that you're talking about, the nature of work and what humans are created for, again, it kind of goes back to that ideal, everybody's, makes me think of the guy that's sitting on Ventura Beach, in California, who's got a magnifying glass with a piece of wood, and he's using the sun to create pictures on the piece of wood. And he's selling them for like $20. Meanwhile, it took him like 5 hours to make one picture on a piece. Like he's doing what he loves doing, but there's no way that guy is supporting himself.
No, it's a complicated problem, and it's the problem of the industrial age, because when you create these mechanistic systems. By the way, I had never thought about what you said, that work is tied to the economy. I just never really thought about that. That was a really profound thought that you had there.
It's more for me than it is for you.
When you said that, I was cracking up. Yes, it is. Work is tied to the economy.
Well, it's never just right.
No,
I
know what you were trying to say. It's just the way it came out was hilarious. But what you're in the industrial age, we've created these these systems of productivity that we become dependent on because they're so efficient. So that what we now depend upon in terms of what we can produce requires our dependency on the productive system that produces it. And so we become dependent. There's a lot of forms of dependency. In other words, if the entire electric grid went down, we'd be really in a lot of trouble because we're so dependent on all of these systems, and they're quite vulnerable. And so we have a lot of interest in maintaining these things and not sabotaging them, because we would be toast if you just imagine if someone like sabotaged the electric grid, or we got a huge like solar storm that took down the entire like we would be toast. But the other kind of dependency is the fact that we I have a lawn now, and so I have to have a lawnmower, and then that lawnmower has to be maintained, but it has to be created and made. And you don't make a lawnmower by hand. You make it as the product of an assembly line. And somebody's got to manage that production process. So it creates a situation in which it's like, well, how do you liberate yourself from the kind of demeaning nature of it? And it's hard, but I think all along the church has been trying to say that the way you do that is that you have to create an environment within those places of employment that really honors and respects the dignity of the person. And we've done that with things like sane working hours, workers' compensation, adequate time for breaks. And if a company's really good, creating community among the, among the employees, having, a good spirit about the place, making sure people are reasonably comfortable and safe when they're working and things like that. So it's that kind of thinking. So with AI, it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? And this kind of goes into the second major point about the economy that he makes that I think is really critical. Is first of all, you have to realize that there's a kind of slavery that the digital world has created. It's a new kind of slavery, but it's still slavery. One is on the user end. So the addictive nature of the use of these devices is tapping into something in the human brain that's making us slaves to it. And I think everybody is experiencing that.
Sure.
But the other side of it, which I think is really important that he points out, is that we have to look at the production chain of production that goes on behind the devices that we use, because these devices that we have, these phones, are largely the result of slave labor in other parts of the world. And these people are utterly forgotten. Nobody, everybody has a cell phone, but nobody thinks about who's creating these devices in all the little stages and steps of the production process, starting with the mining, of the rare earth minerals that are needed for the chips and da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks about that. So what happens is, especially you have companies in mostly developed parts of the world that live very sophisticated. I mean, the people that are working in those corporations, they're getting a great salary, they're living a great life materially, but the raw materials that are necessary for the production and the actual production of the devices themselves are happening in other parts of the world, under working conditions that in our country here in the United States, for example, we would never tolerate for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So Pope Leo and every pope has pointed this out. Like, there is a lack of concern for the dignity of the people and the working conditions of those that are actually creating the devices. So there's a kind of slavery on both sides of the equation, the consumer side and the production side. And so part of what we have to do is we have to be, first of all, honest about this reality. And we together, there's no single point of solution. It's a collective effort. Everybody at every level of society has to contribute in some way to eradicating and liberating these forms of servitude and slavery within our our
Sure.
economic
Yeah.
system, so that first and foremost, work is dignified
Yeah.
and it's respectful to the nature of the human person, but also in the consumption of these products, we're not dehumanizing ourselves.
Mm.
And so that again goes back to the education. We have to be educated in the
Yep.
proper use of
Yep.
these things. So that really covers chapter 4. I mean, that's the overarching question of, how do we deal with the question of truth
Mm-hmm.
and the question of work in this age of artificial intelligence.
Okay.
So, moving then to chapter 5, the culture of power and the civilization of love. Here he's dealing with the problem of violence and the use of technology in violence and in warfare particularly. And it's one of these things where it's like it's complicated because on the one hand, technology has given us the capacity to be so much more accurate and precise in the use of weaponry
Yeah.
that we have the capability of really minimalizing civilian deaths.
For sure. Yeah.
And I think we can see in our country, for example, that we do exercise often that type of restraint, which
Mm-hmm.
is kind of a marvel. But on the other hand, technology is become so powerful that the capability and the possibility of doing unbelievable violence to the human family is always right there at our fingertips now.
Yeah.
Like the level of destruction. I mean, this goes all the way back to, post-industrial warfare in general. But we just see the capabilities today. And I think that the Pope raises a number of really critical things for us to be thinking about when it comes to this. Number one is we always have to keep conscience and personal moral agency at the center of any decision to use violence. So you can't just hand over decision making to artificial intelligence. So you can think about creating robots
Mm-hmm.
that go in
Yeah.
and they're animated by artificial intelligence, and they're just going in and they're just making whatever decisions they have to make.
Mm.
So we're not quite there yet, but we're
Yeah.
very close to being there. He makes a really huge deal that there has to be a human chain of command that is capable of exercising conscience and making moral decisions within the actual theater and context of war.
Mm.
And all of the same old principles of just war theory and self-defense need to be respected.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that does that make sense? I mean, you track in that. I mean, you think
Yeah.
about the Terminator
Right.
movie series, and that's
Yeah.
that's
No, I'm thinking about movies where there's always that kind of that human moment in battle where the character will have to make a very difficult moral decision. Like, do I kill this person? Do I show mercy to this person? Why am I making the choice that I'm making? Like, yeah, it seems like that's never going to be something that any sort of artificial intelligence is really going to be able to make. You know what I mean?
yeah, because
And a lot of times those things can turn the complete nature of the battle around, because of it. Or, you know what I'm saying? I'm
Mhm.
thinking about oh man, there was a movie where that was the kind of the dilemma where the guy chose not to kill the enemy soldier. And so I totally get what you're saying. There has to be, like, if you remove any humanity out of a situation like that, then it's just what yeah what's the word I'm looking for? It just becomes a matter of like, kill this person, don't kill this person.
Yeah, it's just a result of a computer program.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
you can set up all of the, you can write the code or write the program for it, and then just have them go in and do it. Again,
Right.
if the technology is like, if I have the technology and I can say, okay, we want to take out, we have an enemy that's attacking us, and we want to take out all of their weapon systems and try to absolutely minimize, if not outright eliminate, the possibility of any humans dying in this process.
Right. Yeah.
That would be a really great use of
Yeah.
AI
Sure.
and
Right.
robotics.
Yeah.
But again, the inverse is always, we now, I mean, we've seen it with the Iran situation, how accurately we can use AI to target individuals
Right.
and take them out, and it raises a lot of ethical and moral questions as to whether or not, and of course, if you give that kind of power to a surveillance totalitarian state, my gosh, the way they could use that against their own people or their own political enemies is frightening.
Yeah.
So and that kind of thing is already happening. So that's one major point he makes. I think probably the biggest point that he covers throughout this chapter, and he comes to it again and again and again, is and it's hard to disagree, but we're just seeing more and more of an attitude that just thinks of war as the inevitable solution to every problem we have. Violence is just how you solve human conflict. And we're seeing that with a rise of just civilian violence for political motivated purposes. But we're also seeing that on a geopolitical scale, where it's just like, hey, if we can't get what we want, forget diplomacy, forget dialogue, forget trying to work things out. Now, one of the things that, a question that I would raise, and questions didn't arise for me a whole lot in this document, but the one question that I don't feel was addressed is like, that's all well and good as long as you have two parties that want to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what's
Right.
hard, is that what do you do when, and there's a moral education problem, there's a cultural education problem underneath that, where there are certain ideologies in the world that have become, like communism and socialism, that have become so pervasive in the world over the last century, and their answer to every problem is violence. But the Pope also, and he does point that out, and he points out there's also these other organizations like terror groups and cartels that deal with everything in terms of violence and some kind of form of warfare. And what he's seeing is that as the moral conscience of the human race declines, violence is once again increasing. When you look down through the history of the human race, we've almost always been at war with each other. And after World War II, we had a little, kind of a cessation of so much conflict. We still had war and conflict, but there was at least a greater social consciousness about the evils of war and a sincere desire to pursue avenues of peace and dialogue and greater forms of global justice that would try to mitigate against the tendency of the nations of the world to war.
Yeah.
But that consensus has fairly quickly started breaking down again. And it's just all of a sudden we can see over the last decade this massive uptick. I mean, just the fact that Putin would line up along the border of Russia or Ukraine, kind of like old World War I, World War II style, and then just march in and start invading and conquering territory, was kind of shocking. You're like, really? I thought we were all over this. Like, it's 2000, I think it was 21 or something like that. I'm like, this is unreal. Or what happened in Gaza on, a few years ago, or in Israel, with the whole, not in Gaza, but with the whole, kind of terrorist attack inside of Israel. And, it's just that kind of barbarism, you would think, is behind us. So the Holy Father is just simply saying, look, when you combine a greater susceptibility to violence with the kind of technology and warfare that we have now. Like, this is not a good thing. This could get really, this could become a bloodbath, a worldwide bloodbath very quickly. He doesn't say it like that, but that's the implication of what he's saying.
Yeah, I guess the way I see it is, the way you framed it out is post-World War II, it seems like that most of the world is still in that mindset of, we don't want to repeat this, and so how can we approach conflict that, like, I don't want to say inevitable conflict, but if there's violent conflict that needs to be dealt with, how can we do it in a way where we're not sending millions of people to their death? Like, I do think most of the world is like, we don't want to, there's no way we want to repeat that. You do have some
and
of
yet we've just repeated it in Ukraine.
Well, okay, so, but I would put him as one of those guys who's not bought into that idea. So it's like, and so the rest of the world is like, well, how can we, in a sense, it seems like, how can we use technology to sort of obliterate or at least minimize the barbarism, like to minimize the people that are, he's a bit of a holdover from that, and how you deal with that is really tricky because there's such a large, powerful nation versus, let's say, like some little country, Iran, for instance, where it's like, okay, we're gonna use this technology to kind of minimize the potential of catastrophic, conflict. Russia's a little bit of a different.
Well, it is. I mean, all three of those situations I just named are different. And even the situation down in Venezuela, I mean, we have lots of examples of different types of military activity and action and different uses of technology. Like, for example, Ukraine, its use of drones and satellite, Starlink, they've just completely incapacitated Russia. I mean, Russia's losing territory right now, and that's just unheard of. For a kind of almost superpower to be able to, to kind of lose.
So is the Pope more warning? What is the warning? Is it for the countries that are? Is he more like, hey? I'm trying to figure out what he's saying.
Well, he's pointing out that there's a normalization of violence that's taking place right now, which is a regression from where we've been.
So because we can use this technology and it's very neat and tidy, let's use it all the time.
That's a different matter. It's we need to rededicate ourselves to building a just world order as a community of nations, so that we eliminate the kind of desperation and the type of ideologies and the fundamentalisms and the radicalization of people that leads to the kind of violence that we're seeing. So what's happening is that violence is being normalized now because we're not addressing the underlying issues. And what we're doing is we're reaching for military solutions to these problems. Which are only going to exacerbate the problems and make the resentments worse. And it takes generations to heal from these kinds of situations. We thought we had learned our lesson after World War I and World War II, but what he's saying is that apparently we haven't. And as the World War II generation begins to die out and the living memory of those horrors dies with them, are we going to be back to square one? But now, and this is the second point, now we have artificial intelligence and robotics at our disposal on top of nuclear weapons. So if we're desensitized to violence and we have these profound weapons, we are going to be in a very, very, I mean, it's total destruction. There may be no coming back from what could happen if we don't recover our conscience in the face, and our humanity in the face of this.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, he teases out all of the particulars of that
Mm.
basic problem
Yeah.
as I just
Yeah. Yeah.
as I just framed it out. I mean, so again, it's worth reading because he kind of like he really he teases out all the particular things that have kind of come together in this kind of convergent way to create the conditions that are, we stand at the threshold of World War III, and even Pope Francis was saying, a few years ago about how we already are in kind of World War III, but it's being fought piecemeal here and there all over the world. And that's because the fundamental living conditions of human beings in most countries is not good. I think as Americans, sometimes it's really hard for us to understand this because we still live with democratic institutions. We have, representative government, the rule of law, respect for private property, the reasonable respect for free speech and economic initiative. And, like we have a lot of great things. And, if the other nations of the world would all embrace these values. But the reality is, in large swaths of the world, people do not live in those conditions, and they become desperate.
Yeah.
And in their desperation, they get idealized. They get, they take on ideologies,
Mm-hmm.
and they get weaponized, and then they fight. And that's and so as it's a global problem that requires a global solution because we all have we're all contributing to the problem, but we're all stakeholders in it because now it's not like we're not just dealing with cannons, like we're dealing with nuclearized, highly weaponized countries that can do irreparable damage to the earth. So he really lays out how we really need to build a civilization of love. And that's that, he identifies certain things that are going to bring about that civilization of love. And this is really how he kind of closes out the document too, because he kind of ends he ends chapter 5 by really talking about how we have to dedicate ourselves to building a civilization of love. And we do that by means of, first of all, he talks about multilateralism, which is, every nation has to be able to sit around the table, and we all need to talk our differences out, and we need to work out our peace. But the primary insight of the church, generation after generation, is that when we work together to build the conditions of a just social order, we take away the motivating underlying causes for violence.
Sure.
So if if we want peace, we have to work for justice. That's what the church always says. And therefore we have to create, the conditions where people's basic dignity and humanity is respected and honored. And they can, people can at least live a basically decent human life.
Yeah.
And again, in the United States, it's hard for us to imagine this, because we have it pretty good, but there's a lot of parts of the world that don't have it so good.
Okay. That's a lot. He's saying a lot.
He is saying a lot. And I'm just obviously scratching the surface of all the particular things, but
Yeah.
I
think again, for me, just this will be my kind of like last thought, is the temptation hearing all of that is to be so caught up in how big it is, like the massive, all these little pieces that are like totally interwoven geopolitically and globally, and it's like, okay, bring it back to me, Scott Lieb. Like what is my little part in all of this to, what did you say, dedicate, myself to a household of love. You know what I mean? Like, what does that look like for me to take all the principles that he's laying out there and, live our family life as best we can towards those things,
Yeah.
like, Yeah, and have these conversations about. We actually have a lot of conversation around AI and the good, the bad, all that stuff. And it's like, you know, if I guess if individual families, if individual people just took that to heart, and you're right, you would see a difference pretty immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think on the domestic level, I think, educating people, like, how do we sensitize our kids to the realities of violence? I know in my household, I wasn't really keen on violent video games where you're just sitting around killing people. Not that my kids would go out and kill someone, but you can become desensitized to the lived reality that people who have actually experienced war have had to live with.
Mm.
Like, we should sensitize. I remember, I always tell the story when I was in high school, the World War II vets would come and do a little ceremony in our gym. And I was always like distracted, and my friends and I, we were always laughing and making fun of, what are they doing? I just had no concept,
Right.
zero.
Sure.
Years later, in my early 20s, or maybe my late 20s, I was watching Private Ryan. We always heard about Normandy and that. Yeah, whatever. Like, in high school, that was my attitude until I watched, Saving Private Ryan. And I remember I was just so, I was like it just crushed me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was that age.
Yeah.
And I was trying to imagine what it would be like to be them. And it was so real. And I thought, oh my gosh, I feel like such a complete ass. Because I immediately thought of how it was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
But see, that's the kind of thing. It's
Sure.
like, I had at least the opportunity to listen to the stories of vets tell their stories about what they went through. So part of the educational piece here for us on the level of violence and war is to, instead of radicalizing our feelings towards violence, we need to sensitize ourselves and to help our young people understand what it's really like to live your life having had to live through and undergo that kind of an experience. The church says, never again, war, never again, never again. It says it over and over again. It's always a loss for humanity. Sometimes it's necessary because there are evil people in the world and we have to defend ourselves against them. But what the Pope is pointing out here is that we should not subscribe to a kind of realism, a negative, kind of cynical realism that says, well, it's inevitable, so it's just the way the world is. And he says, no, we have to push back against that mindset and embrace a different kind of realism, which is that we can achieve peace if we commit ourselves to the pathways of justice and dialogue and collaboration and cooperation and be sensitive to the lived reality of people. And rather than being blind to it or apathetic, that's the key, is we have to be aware of what people experience and say, whatever I can do in my little sphere of influence to make sure that that never happens on my watch as a person, that's what we're all committed and called to do. And as Christian people, that's what it means for us to build the civilization of love. And he ends the document, the whole conclusion is all about just, putting Christ front and center. That Christ reveals to us what it means to be human, what it means to love, what it means to be merciful, what it means to be just. And we, the proper realism we have is that God has revealed his heart to the human race through Christ. And we as Christian people can't subscribe to all of the nonsense that's going on out there in the mainstream. We have to be committed to bringing the gospel into the world and embracing that form of realism, which is we can make the world a more humane place. It's never going to be paradise. It's never going to be perfect.
Right.
But we can make that commitment in little ways if we do it together, and we can lessen the violence, we can lessen the unemployment, we can lessen the inhumane working conditions, because we can make different choices and different decisions. So.
Wow. Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, that's
it.
That's
yeah.
great. I feel like I always feel like, because I say so much, but I feel like I hardly scratched the surface of it. But anyhow, hopefully this has been a helpful little series for you. to learn a little bit more about what Pope Leo is trying to teach us in this time of ours about artificial intelligence and this digital age we live in, and all of the different ways in which we can be harmed by these forms of technology. But I think more importantly, how when we put the human person and the dignity of the human person at the center of all that we do socially in the world, we can make these technologies serve our best interest and our greater good. So if you like these videos, please share them with your friends, and be sure to subscribe to the Wise Guys podcast, and we'll look forward to our next episode.
See you next time.
The Wise Guys podcast is a production of Preambula Group, a Catholic ministry dedicated to helping you thrive in the heart of Jesus. Visit us on the web at preambula.org and follow us on social media.